Hello, nonprofit leaders and friends. You're going to love today's guest, Julie Beem. She's the executive director with the Attachment and Trauma Network. And I will tell you, her life completely changed. She and her husband, they were already parents, and they fell in love with a sweet little girl who was living her worst life at an orphanage in China. They soon learned that unconditional love and proven parenting practices that they'd used with their other kids were just not enough for their newly adopted daughter. In desperation, they reached out via telephone, and you remember what telephones are, right? So this kind of tells you how long ago this was. They reached out via telephone to a relatively new organization at the time, run by, get this, a former veterinarian who knew how to help them understand attachment disorder and how to adapt their parenting toward healing the trauma that their daughter had undergone. Julie began her relationship with the Attachment and Trauma Network as a parent in need of support and advice, and now she's the executive director. I can't wait for you to hear her story. Hey, have you ever wished you could hear some good news for a change? Well, I might have just what you've been hoping for. Welcome to Your Nonprofit Life, where we remove our rose-colored glasses and explore what leaders are actually doing to move their nonprofits from messy to thriving without burning out in the process. I'm Laura Zelke, Director of Member Experience for the Nonprofit Leadership Lab. Join me each week to explore the ups, downs, and whoopsie daisies of your nonprofit life. Let's get started. So, Julie, welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you here with us this morning.
Thanks, Laura. It's great to be here.
We were just talking about you being down in Marietta, Georgia. Well, down from me. I'm in North Carolina.
We're down.
Yeah,
this is the South.
This is the South. And Georgia's been opening up this week from the pandemic. And I was just curious, you and I were talking a little bit earlier about everybody going online with the sheltering at home, and people are getting introduced to Zoom and all these Microsoft Teams and all the different online things. But you've been doing your work at Attachment and Trauma Network online for how long?
Well, we've been remote since we were founded 25 years ago because the founders knew that they couldn't reach all of the families across the country in any other way. But we've been doing online conferencing since it was early, before the cameras were even working. So we joke when people are like, how is your work different? And we're like, it's not different. We just go to work and get on the Zoom room just like always.
The reason I'm asking is because I met my husband online. Now we're going on, it'll be 24 years in June. And I know that when I met him online, there was a floppy disk. There was an internet modem that you would buy, and you would hear this horrendous sound when you would dial up on your phone.
Right.
Let's see, there was Alta Vista, there was Prodigy, and I met him on a thing called America Online, which is now AOL, right? I mean,
right.
Those are the days. So when you say you've been doing this virtually for 25 years, that's a year before I even met my husband. And so how did you do it online or virtually back then?
Well, we weren't actually, the ability to look at each other is fantastic. It was much more chat room, eventually email, the Yahoo groups that just recently retired, right? And lots of phones and phone conferencing. But the point was that families were in distress and they had no other way to connect. So we've adopted the technology as fast as we could find it.
I was going to say, that's really, really impressive. And how wonderful it is to have online, high-speed video chat and video conferencing, and the ability to have more than one person online to have these groups. So before we get too far into our conversation, I was wondering if you could tell us about the Attachment and Trauma Network. What is the work that you actually do there?
We are dedicated to supporting children who've been impacted by early childhood trauma. And we do that primarily through their families and parents, and then also through their teachers and schools. So that's it in a nutshell.
Okay, let's crack the nutshell open and go a little bit deeper with it. Talk to me about attachment and trauma. Like, what exactly are you talking about there?
That's a good question, and it's a question a lot of folks have.
Uh-huh.
25 years ago, the families that came looking for support and education were families who knew that their children's behaviors and symptoms, if you will, because there are disorders related to this, had to do with their inability to connect and attach to the parents. So we started with the attachment piece, with what makes good, healthy attachment. And a lot of times those families were foster or adoptive, or maybe grandparents or other relatives raising children who had had some impact from early hardships, but no one had connected the dot to trauma yet. So in the beginning, attachment and trauma were not related. What we now know, because there's so much more neuroscience and all kinds of information that has come over the last 25 years, is that children who come out of a lot of hardships can have an inability to build healthy relationships, healthy attachments with their families, and that has a lifelong impact. The reverse is true, though. The more connection that you can have with a child early on, the healthier you are to build that emotional connection with infants and toddlers, the more resiliency that you build into their system. So attachment and trauma network was initially more about attachment disorders and trauma disorders, but now we like to say attachment is the antidote for the early childhood trauma, because pouring into that relationship helps children to become more resilient. And that's true whether they have problems that are at a level of being a disorder or just all of our children. And I think part of the awareness that we want to bring to all of this is that attachment is a natural thing and a thing that occurs without an awareness around it a lot of times in early infancy and in being toddlers, unless some traumas or hardships disrupt it. And that's the message around all of that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it really does. And like you said, I think the fact that what you're saying, the attachment part isn't necessarily something that's intentional.
Right.
It's just kind of innate and intentional unless there's something else going on. And do you think that sometimes the trauma is unintentional?
We like to demystify and destigmatize that word, because a lot of times we think about trauma as being solely something that's caused by another person, like child abuse. That's where a lot of people's minds go. And that truly can be the early adversity or the early childhood trauma. But children who have medical traumas, for example, children who've spent a long time in the NICU as infants or had several hospitalizations because they have other physical illnesses when they're very young, can actually experience the same level of trauma as other kinds of causes of that trauma. And that's really through no fault of anyone's, because obviously you have to get the child the medical care that they need. But you have to understand how that impacts their emotional development and their ability to connect, and even their whole view of the world and themselves. I mean, am I safe? Can I trust these adults? Those types of innate feelings become hardwired into us from the very beginning. So that's part of what we teach parents and teachers and others who come to us, is what healthy attachment means and how you get back to that if there's been a problem. Obviously, even your surroundings in terms of how safe of a neighborhood you live in, or your poverty status, all of that can impact a child in a traumatic way. And it's really through no fault of the parents, for sure.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. I mean, yes, there is child abuse, but then there are also other extenuating circumstances that have that same result. And you said hardwired. Is it possible to rewire the brain, do you think?
Oh, we're so thankful that it is at ATN, that the neurological piece, for me personally and for us as an organization, has become an incredibly powerful tool for us to help people understand that just because a child has experienced all of these things does not mean that their life is hopeless. A lot of early information out there does sound very hopeless and very negative, but we know so much more about how brains work, about how brains learn, the types of things to put in, not just from an academic cognitive standpoint, but even what we call underneath all of that, where your emotional brain lives and how you can use all kinds of incredible tools. Now, is it harder to do that than if the child had not had those traumas and had really healthy attachment from the beginning? Of course, it's harder, but it can be done, and it can be done even with adults. Our brains grow and change all the time, and I think that's the exciting news about that.
It just gives me so much hope.
Mm-hmm.
It gives me so much hope for parents and caretakers of children who have really gone through some rough times, that it can be changed. And that's really exciting. So let me ask you this. How did you come to be in the nonprofit sector yourself? Is this something that you were always aspiring to, or how did you end up where you are with Attachment and Trauma Network?
Oh no, this was purely accidental. I was on a trajectory in the corporate world in marketing for consulting services around engineers and architects, and living in the Midwest, and then decided to adopt our daughter, our youngest, from China.
Mm-hmm.
And it was in the act of doing that I discovered what I didn't know about attachment and trauma, right?
Right.
And I didn't know what I even needed to know. And I was very thankful to find the folks at the Attachment and Trauma Network to support our family. And that shifted our trajectory considerably.
So you were in corporate, and then through the adoption and the process of raising your daughter, came into contact with ATN. So you came to them because you needed
I
help,
needed help,
but
right?
now you're the executive director. So how did that happen?
Well, it's a job of passion. What happened was that our world really, my daughter was very significantly impacted. She was highly neglected and likely abused, although we don't know much about her history for the 19 months that she was in the orphanage. All we knew was that she had some significant behaviors and challenges and things that we didn't know how to overcome, and neither did most of the professionals that we were trying to seek advice from. So ATN and the families there and the professionals that provided information there were really a lifeline to us. So my world, career-wise, slowed way down and then eventually came to a stop. I worked part-time as a consultant and then eventually had to stop working because of her needs and of what we needed to do therapeutically and parenting-wise with her. And then the more that I learned about that, the more that I saw that was a great need. And as she started healing and doing better, and I got more time to go back to work in some way, it just made sense that that work was with ATN, because once you experience that and see the need, it's not that engineering and architecture aren't highly important, it's just that this was more important to me. And so the original founder, who did not have a business background, she was actually a veterinarian before she did the very same thing, gave up what she was doing to focus on her children and all the other children. She needed some people who knew about various pieces of business, and marketing was my background, and I said, I'm all in. So when she then retired, her children were grown and she was having grandchildren, and she wanted to stay home and play with the grandbabies, which is a great gig if you can get it, right?
Right.
Then it just made sense for me to step in as the executive director.
Wow. In hearing your story, to me, it's so inspiring, because I think sometimes people have a misconception that the people who become the leaders in nonprofit went to college to get a nonprofit degree and all the administrative and the internships, like a career trajectory for it, or that they were an executive in a business and just did the switch. And you are testimony to the fact that executive directors also come through the ranks sometimes, where they start out as someone who needs the service. And then did you go from that straight into staff, or did you volunteer for a while?
Well, actually, we were all volunteers for a very long while. I mean, this organization has survived on passion. So I was volunteer helping to support other parents on the
Mm-hmm.
onlines and those types of things, and then sort of volunteer staff, if you will, to
Mm-hmm.
help come
Mm-hmm.
up with marketing strategies
Sure.
and build a website and all of those things in the early times. And in fact, until about 3 years ago, 25 minus 3, that's how long this has been going,
Mm-hmm.
nobody was paid a salary at ATN,
Wow.
because whatever money we did raise, whatever money we were able to get a hold of, needed to go back into the technology and the services and not to the people. And it wasn't until around 2015 and 16 when we found a bigger revenue stream, and that was in our outreach to teachers and schools. We had about 4 or 5 members from all over the country who were teachers or counselors in public school, and were also parents of children who'd been highly impacted by trauma. So they got it on that side, and what they were doing was pockets of excellence in their own schools in terms of helping the schools understand how trauma impacts a child's ability to learn, how many children are truly impacted by this trauma
Mm-hmm.
through something called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And it's about 25% in any classroom, regardless
Wow.
of demographic. So it's a significant thing. So they were doing these little pockets of excellence and sort of chatting back and forth about what they were doing. And we said, look, let's pull everybody together, because once families get stabilized in the ATN world, their next biggest request is, what can we do to help the schools understand so our children don't feel out of control, dysregulated, anxious about going to school, that it doesn't rock their world so much. So from this core group came our schools program, where we initially did trainings and they would travel to whatever school would invite them. And then in 2018, we hosted our first national conference. And we literally didn't know what to expect from that. We actually called it our Thelma and Louise moment, because we had had some conferences back in the early 2000s for parents, and they were beautiful conferences, except that only about 100 parents could attend, and we were ponying up our own money to try to figure out how to pay off the venue and that type of thing. So I was really nervous, and they convinced me that we should just drive off the cliff and see what happened. And we're like, okay, financially, this is where we're going, right off the cliff. And we didn't go off the cliff. We actually jumped the gap. In our first year, we had 700 people at the conference. And then in 2019, we had 1,200 people. And then this last February, we were fortunate to get the conference in before anyone knew about the virus much. And we had 1,700 teachers here in Atlanta. It was a fabulous conference and continues to grow. And the schools are truly embracing trauma-informed education models. And probably what we understand from what is happening to schools now is that so many of those teachers are very aware of how this new quarantine and distance learning are going to be impacting their children. And we're excited is the wrong word, because it's a tragedy, obviously, that we need to have trauma-informed schools. But we're here, and we're gearing up and thinking about what can we do to help those teachers as they come back to whatever their new school situation is going to be, in terms of children coming from very traumatized situations. For some of them, school is the safest place to be, and they haven't been there for weeks and weeks and weeks. And
Right.
for others, any major change at all, school, home, is very dysregulating and upsetting. And so actually, Laura, we've been busy as we can be at
I
the
was going to
ATN.
say, when I think about the situation that children are going through, we're coming out of Child Abuse Awareness Month and into Foster Care Month and Mental Health Month in May. And the leaders that I've been interviewing, we've been talking about the children at home. I interviewed a CASA executive, and she's crying because there are no eyes on these kids that normally you would have that. And talking with another executive up in Wisconsin, and her organization reaches out to children in crisis who are being pulled into foster care and that type of thing. And again, the reporting has gone down because that first line of teachers, bus
Right,
drivers who would normally do the reporting are not seeing the children. And
right.
so while you were talking, I was thinking, gosh, there are kids probably right now who through this experience are being traumatized. And so
Yes.
not only are you serving the community, the already existent community, but then your community is probably being increased right now. It's heartbreaking, and yet it's also just heartwarming that your organization exists to help. Have you always been kind of a national organization?
We have always been based on need, a national organization. The organization was originally founded in Kansas City, and our founder, Nancy Spoolstra, and a group of mothers whose children were being treated by the same therapist started having coffee, started supporting each other, and then decided that they needed more education. So they started reaching out to experts in the field and paying them to either teleconference with them or come in to Kansas City or whatever. And before long, other parents from across the country actually found out about that and started connecting with this core group in Kansas City, who then, by the time that I was introduced to ATN, I was introduced in an online chat room, but also on the phone. The executive director was spending about 8 hours a day on the phone with families, usually
Wow.
families in crisis, trying to help them
Yikes.
find local resources, trying to help them get connected to this very tenuous web, online web in those days was very tenuous,
Mm-hmm.
and of other families and resources. And so it has always been national, but always been grassroots. So that makes us kind of odd. Usually when you think about a national nonprofit, you're thinking about some nonprofit that's large, that's got some large number of staff, some large number of donors, some large number of clients served. And our numbers of families and children that we serve is relatively large compared to the man behind the curtain, which is
I was
relatively
going to
small.
say, yeah. So, one of the things that you and I talked about during our earlier interview was you just got a pretty big grant.
We did. The same week that we had our conference, which was amazing on the schools side for our schools program, we received word from the Conrad and Hilton Foundation that they were going to underwrite a big development project this year for our parent side of the house. And so we are upgrading our online capabilities in big ways for the parent side. We're building a searchable, interactive resource database, something that's been needed for our organization for, well, we've been imagining it for about a decade, and now here it comes. So we're really excited, where families and anybody actually can go on and search for trauma-informed and attachment-focused resources in their area, therapists and programs and places that provide trauma-informed care that they may not know about. And it will significantly help us in that one-on-one interaction with folks who are looking for resources. We know that about 10,000 to 15,000 people a year hit the list of resources we have on our website. So we don't know what it's going to look like number-wise when we actually get an
Sure.
interactive database, but we're excited about that. We're also going to be building more educational materials and things that are easily served up online, because we have come to realize and embrace after 25 years the fact that most of our work is going to be online. And so we're trying to provide things that are as interactive and are as personal as they can be, using the best technology that we can find. So,
Well, I just have to say, when you think, it almost sounds like the start of a joke when you say, okay, what happens when you get a veterinarian and an architecture and engineering marketing person together,
yeah,
in a room?
right.
But it sounds like you really coming into this, that this is something that really you have the chops. And here's why I say that. It's not just that you have the marketing and the website development, but doing the marketing for architecture and engineering has really put you in the mindset of understanding the neuroscience and being able to explain that to the average person who may not really get it, who may not, my brain does not comprehend neuroscience per se. And yet I know that you are able to explain it to me. And I feel like the skill set that you brought to the table here, plus your own personal experience in forming it, it's just really incredible to see you thrive in this position. And so I do have a question for you about the leadership aspect of it. We've talked a lot about the organization and the children and the brain, but I wonder for you personally. So you were in marketing, website design, whatever, and you get into doing the volunteering and then coming alongside the founder. And really, you've been with the organization for quite a while, right? How many years?
About 15 at this point.
15 years.
Mhm.
So you're coming in after the founder, and you're actually the first full-time staff that they've had, right? Or
Yes.
any staff,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And so how has that transition been as far as coming into run a nonprofit when you don't have the degree in nonprofit management? How has that been? How has your board been? And what's it like following the founder?
Well, it could be tricky following the founder, but Nancy did a good job of stepping out. She said she was stepping out, and she really did.
Hmm.
I think I was concerned at the beginning that she would be able to walk away from her baby, right? Because
Hmm.
that's a big deal. When you found something, it's part of your identity. But she was very serious about wanting to get to a different place in her life. And so we actually check in very little. She found out about 3 or 4 days ago about the grant just because I had forgotten to mention it to her, and we happened to be chatting about our lives, our quarantine lives, and I said, "Oh, did I tell you this?" And she's that far removed and watching from afar, and watching, I think, with a sense of real accomplishment and pride, which is great. Our board, up until last year, was a working board. Of the people who got on the board actually generally had almost an assigned staff position in our programming somehow. And because of the influx of funds and the increase of funding that we've been able to get a hold of over the last 2 or 3 years, which had been my biggest challenge. If you'd interviewed me 2 years ago, I'd have said, finding funds is the hardest thing. And it still is hard, but we are now in a position where we've been able to hire. We have 3 employees and about 5 contractors of various roles. And so we switched to a governance board last year. We used Jones guidelines because it was like, okay, we're flying blind on this as to what to do, but my board is fantastic. My board president is similar to me in that she has some business background, and she's been a mom of a child impacted by trauma. And so she flies alongside me really well. We work really well together, and it's been very exciting bringing in board members who have multiple different business perspectives now, as opposed to people who were highly motivated to be on the board because they had the similar passion to me. They'd lived through it in some way.
Right.
Now we have folks that are coming from various aspects, and they obviously have a touch point of knowing somebody who's been
Hmm.
traumatized or impacted in some way, but they're coming from different avenues. And it's just such a richer conversation. And I so love the whole collaborative style of leadership and management that I'm big on that. And especially since we're all across the country, it's part of my job to constantly figure out how to stream those conversations and
Hmm.
connect with each other and bounce ideas off of each other. And hopefully that helps makes the board feel and my staff feel empowered to understand the directions that we're going then and act on them so that they don't feel like they're pigeonholed and have to wait on somebody else to make a decision on high, that it's more about we're all rowing the boat in the same direction, if you will.
Yeah, it's inspiring to hear this. And this is one of the questions that I have just even going forward for some other nonprofit, maybe who have only been local. Now that people are getting a little bit more comfortable being online. So your board is not local to the Atlanta area. They're all over the United States.
Yes, in fact, I don't even have another board or staff member in the Atlanta area. I have in the past, but I don't at this point. We've got board members everywhere from DC to Seattle and every place in between. And we rarely see each other. They all come to the national conference and have some kind of an assigned task there. And that's where, and except for that and our board retreat where they meet once a year, that we don't have any in-person meetings. I almost said face-to-face, which isn't true at all because we
Right.
face-to-face all the time using the technology. But we all do all of our committee meetings and all of our board meetings via Zoom. And that's the way we work. And we're constantly looking for tools. We're implementing Slack this week.
Oh,
with the board
how
because,
fun.
yeah, because they want that level of communication, and it just
Wow.
makes sense for them to be able to keep track of that instead of the hundreds and hundreds of emails.
Oh, yeah, for
Seem to be
sure.
problematic. Yeah, so always looking for new online tools
Hmm.
because we don't ever envision a time that we're all going to be geographically next door to each other.
Sure. Well, I think that that can have its benefits. It may have some drawbacks, but with the technology, as more and more people are learning, you can have an actual real relationship where you laugh and cry together, even over Zoom, because it just does have that in person feeling. It's so funny. I think back on the movies from the 80s, the Back to the Future with Michael J. Fox, and how they would have the video call on the wall. And it seems so far off in the future. And are we ever going to be like that? Oh, that's so fake. And here we are doing it right now across the world, really. And it's just so inspiring to see how you've really just kind of taken the organization on as your own. How do you recruit board members? I'm really curious about that because you are so decentralized. Like, how do you find new board members when you're nationwide like this?
That is probably one of our biggest challenges. Right now, the board members that we have are connected to members in some way. Some member
Hmm.
has brought forth, either they're related to a member or they're a coworker or an acquaintance that has the business backgrounds that we're looking for.
Hmm.
That's probably one of our bigger challenges, is figuring out a way to vet and put in the pipeline and even find volunteer opportunities for board members who are not directly impacted by
Hmm.
this, because the folks that generally do volunteer with us and that we have find volunteer roles for have lived this life, either, or are
Right,
living this life, either as a parent or an educator,
right.
or in some cases someone who themselves have been highly impacted by trauma as a
Mm,
young person and have significantly healed. And those are folks that we love to have among our ranks because they're able to really confirm for us what it feels
sure.
like on the inside, right? And they generally are as passionate. We recruit on that passion a lot. I mean, for board, for volunteers, for staff, they have the passion for seeing how important this is.
Hmm.
So I didn't really answer your question because it's a
Because
challenge.
it's the
Yeah,
challenge.
it's an ongoing challenge. We'd
Yeah.
love advice from others as to how we do that, and it's just who knows who at this point.
Right. And I think that on some level, I mean, that is what you do, no matter if you're virtual or not. It's who do you know? Who do they know? And based on the needs. And I can see, though, the importance, and this is something that we talk about in the lab a lot, is the importance of diversification on your board, that it would be important to not have every single board member be like a first person
Right.
connected to the attachment and trauma, just because you kind of want a set of outside eyes, I guess, to
Exactly.
look, somebody else to look at it who isn't so closely tied and passionate. And yet you need someone who's also compassionate about it and willing to learn about it, right? So, yeah, that would be hard. That is a challenge. So, one of the things that I'm going to do in the show notes is definitely put links to your organization and how to get in touch with you. And it's possible maybe someone would have some suggestions or ideas for how to find those board
That would be
members.
awesome. We would appreciate that.
I am curious. I have to ask because you said you went from a working board to a governing board now. And did you start out with term limits?
Yes, well, we had term limits even as the working board.
Okay.
We would sometimes break those because somebody was like on the board and doing a really great working job.
Right, right.
But over the last 2 or 3 years, what we realized was that we were getting ready to hire people, whether the money was actually there or not, and that they needed to become some kind of staff or consultant sort of piece. And so we purposely had those people roll off the board at the end of their terms,
Ah, gotcha.
to get ourselves ready. This last year, though, it was just a complete shift. So we brought new folks in, that everybody's working on a 3-year term. There were some folks that were getting ready to roll off that we asked to stay on an additional
Mm-hmm.
1 or 2 years so that
Mm-hmm.
the staggering worked out,
Sure.
in the right way.
Smart.
We spent our first retreat together not even doing any strategic planning, which felt really odd and has left us in an odd place this year strategically, because there were so many new board members that we felt like it's hard to
Yeah.
strategize something you don't know that much about. So instead, we spent a lot of time talking about what governance looked like, what development looked like, and what their roles were in that. Got some good, strong committees, and I'm loving the strength of our board. They're good folks.
Yeah. And honestly, had you planned the strategy, you probably would have that on the back burner right now anyway. So
Exactly.
it sounds like it all worked out. And I really want to affirm that decision to just focus on the people, focus on the training and setting expectations. It really sounds like you are poised for some real growth. And, it's kind of a bittersweet, like you said. It's exciting to see the growth, but then it's sad because of the trauma aspect of it. But to know that you have this organization, you've been around for 25 years already, that's just incredible. Providing this level of support, continuing to learn, embracing the science, embracing the technology, and making this available. So, especially online, even not just for the United States, but really for the world,
Yes.
that this is all available and going out into other countries. The future looks very bright for you in your organization. It's exciting from that aspect of it. And so I'm curious, the last 3 years you've had your conference, it's grown by leaps and bounds, and yet we are in such an uncertain time. Have you started thinking about next year's conference?
Oh, yeah. You always start thinking about a conference before the other one is over, even.
Right.
Yeah. So we have plan A and B
Okay.
and C and D and like all the way. And we don't know whether
Right.
A or B is going to happen for sure. There's like so many variables. We know the power of an in-person conference. We also know that there's technology out there for online resources. We understand how badly teachers need this. We know that, to come full circle in our parenting program, we know that there are schools out there that are far enough along in their trauma-informed work that they're now turning to try to help the parents catch up. So we're excited about that possibility too, and we're embracing some of that in our planning for this next conference, to have more in-person information for parents and for community leaders who are helping parents and families in that realm. We don't know whether that's going to happen in February as slated, live and in person, because we have the contracts in place for that, or whether we're going online and then possibly pushing an in-person to a safer time in the summer. I mean, so much depends on what happens in the world,
Yeah,
right?
it really does.
But we're not going to stop. There's not a chance we're not doing this work.
Well, of course, I was going to say, anybody who could do this on dial-up modems back in the day is going to figure it out for the 21st century. So this has been such a great conversation. I've learned a lot about attachment and trauma and the brain. And I've loved learning about your organization and your own personal journey in the organization. And your daughter is doing well now. She's
doing well. She's 23 and she has a part-time job. And when she's not under the quarantine restrictions, she's an internationally accomplished swimmer.
Wow.
We went to Australia last fall for her to swim, and she also rides horses and does a variety of other things and is light years above any projections that anybody had for her in terms of how her brain has changed and healed. So I'm grateful to her and to her bravery and determination to heal. And she and the other children who are now young adults that I know are really a nice inspirational beacon for the rest of us, I guess.
Sure. Well, and good job, Mom.
Yeah.
This is not an easy thing to do, to parent someone who has gone through that trauma and who has that attachment. And I recall you telling me earlier, she's not your only child. You actually had biological children first, right?
I have biological and stepchildren that are older. There's 4 of them all together, and we have 2 grandbabies. And like I said earlier, that's the better gig.
Right.
But
I'm not quite there yet. Mine's 17 and a half. So, we hopefully have a few years before we get that role. But
yeah, those years go fast. Those college years seem just...
Yeah. As they say, the days are long, but the years are short.
Exactly.
Right now, it all feels long. And my poor guy, he's a senior this year. So it's a little different. I mean,
Yeah, he's missing all of that.
Yeah,
That's sad.
but he's not missing it because he's just not into that kind of stuff. And yet I'm missing it for him.
Right. Yeah. Well, you're missing the closure that comes with that big event. Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll have to figure out our own closure celebration or something. But I just want to thank you so much for the gift of your time this morning. I'm going to put up the links to your organization, how to get in touch with you, and also maybe if there's a particular resource that you find is the most frequently accessed or something like that, the most basic, maybe we can put a link to that as well, just so people aren't having to search around and find it.
Okay.
If there's like a characteristics or something like that, attachment.
Okay. Yeah, we can do that. We also have a link directly to our COVID-19 page that's very helpful for parents and teachers, has some quarantine strategy. And we also have an open support room on Friday afternoons for both parents and teachers who are dealing with this new normal, just a place to sort of release that stress.
Well, thank you. So I'll put all that up on the show notes page. And I just want to thank you again for the important work that you're doing and for just the years and years of dedication to families who are dealing with this and teachers just to help them. I just want to thank you for that. And I will see you in the village.
Thank you, Laura. I really appreciate the opportunity for people to hear our story and for all of the work that you do through this podcast and through the Leadership Lab. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for listening. To access the show notes or share feedback on this podcast and link over to our socials, visit our website at yournonprofitlife.com. That's yournonprofitlife.com. And hey, if you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, you're going to love The Village. It's our exclusive online community where we take what we're learning in the Nonprofit Leadership Lab and apply it. We take it to the next level with live Q&As, boot camps, online book clubs, and legit support from experts committed to helping you extend your nonprofit life. By the way, since we're just getting started, it would mean the world to us if you'd subscribe to the podcast and leave a great review on iTunes. The reviews will help us get the podcast in front of more people as we try to take the whole sector from messy to thriving. See you next time.